What getting high was like in Viking times, and more, is not a tale of idle indulgence, but of ritual, courage, and the heavy breath of Viking men who faced death with honey on their tongues. Mead before battle was more than drink. It was a fire poured into the veins, a golden river drawn from the hive and offered to the gods themselves. In the longhouses, before the shields were lifted and the sails unfurled, the Viking man raised his horn, his eyes glinting in the torchlight, and drank deep. Not to forget fear, but to twist it into something sharper, something fit for the clash of steel. The hall itself thundered with song. Viking food, heavy with smoke and salt, lined the benches, but it was mead that carried the spirit. A Viking child might sit at the far end, watching wide-eyed as the warriors drank. Knowing this was more than a feast, it was the stirring of their souls into battle readiness. The horn passed from hand to hand, each warrior drinking as if he swallowed a fragment of Odin's courage, each sip binding them together like links in the same iron chain. Mead was not merely sweet. It was sacred, brewed from honey, blessed with fire, herbs, and the breath of summer fields. To drink it was to stand in the shadow of gods. The Viking woman who brewed it knew its power. She stirred it with care, whispering charms, knowing that what she set to ferment would one day steady trembling hands and sharpen dulled courage. When the men raised their horns, they raised her work, her hidden craft of survival. A horn of mead could loosen the tongue to boast, but it could also still the heart's panic, reminding a warrior that fear was nothing but weakness fleeing the body. By dawn, when the ships creaked against the tide and the cold bit hard against their faces, the warriors carried that warmth with them. Mead thickened their blood, dulled the edge of doubt, and made the thought of death seem distant, even welcome. In that haze, a Viking could charge into the shield wall with a roar that was half courage, half intoxication, and all the more terrifying for it. This was not folly, this was communion. To drink together was to bind oaths, to seal loyalty in honey and fire. It was the promise that no Viking would turn his back on another, not in feast, not in battle, not even in death. And so, before the clash of swords and the breaking of bones, there was always the horn lifted high, drained deep, passed from warrior to warrior like the breath of life itself. For in the Viking world, mead was more than drink. It was the first weapon, the invisible shield, and the song of courage rising before the storm. The sacred horn was never a mere vessel. To the Viking man, it was a symbol, a bridge between the mortal feast and the halls of the gods. Shaped from the horn of ox or aurochs, polished until it gleamed in the firelight, it carried more than mead. It carried memory, oath, and power. When raised high in the smoke-thickened air of the hall, it was not only a drink that passed from lip to lip, but a promise of brotherhood, of loyalty, of courage, forged in honeyed fire. No Viking feast was complete without it. The longhouse shook with the hammer of voices, shields lined the walls, and the fire crackled in the hearth. But the heart of it all was the horn. A Viking child, seated at the feet of his elders, would watch in silence as the great warriors lifted the sacred vessel. He would see how each draught was more than thirst quenched. It was a ritual, a sign that the warrior's worth was measured not only in the clash of battle, but in the strength with which he held the horn steady, drank deep, and offered words worthy of the gods' hearing. To drink from the horn was to taste more than Viking food and drink. It was to taste the favour of Odin, the wisdom of the mead of poetry, and the thunderous joy of Thor's eternal feasts. The first sip was always offered to the gods, poured into the fire or onto the earth, a gift to those who watched unseen. Only after sacrifice did the men drink, their eyes glimmering with the thought that perhaps the All-Father himself had taken the first taste. The horn itself often bore carvings, beasts snarling, serpents twisting, runes scratched by careful hands. Each mark was a prayer, a claim of honour, or a binding oath that could not be broken without shame. To hold such a horn was to hold history, the memory of fathers and forefathers who had drunk before. And so the Viking woman who carried the filled horn through the hall was as vital as the mead itself. She moved with grace, offering drink to each warrior, and with each bow of her head respect was shown, and oaths renewed. But the sacred horn was not always joy. It was also test. A man who refused it showed cowardice. A man who spilled it shamed himself. A man who drained it without trembling declared himself ready for both battle and the grave. In that simple act, courage was revealed or broken. Thus the horn was no idle ornament. It was the soul of the feast, the silent witness to oaths spoken, songs sung, and bonds made unbreakable. When the last drop was drained, and the horn laid aside, the Viking men rose with their hearts blazing and their brotherhood sealed. The sacred horn had spoken, and in its echo rang the strength of a people who lived, drank, and fought as one. Berserker brews were no simple drink of comfort, but potions born of fire, earth, and madness, crafted to unchain the spirit of the Viking man until he was less man and more beast. In the flicker of torchlight, when the longhouse filled with smoke, and the air thickened with chants, the horn passed not with mead alone, but with strange brews steeped in secrets older than any saga. A Viking child might watch from the shadows, eyes wide with both awe and dread, for what his father drank was not merely a draught, it was a step into the storm. The berserkers were feared and revered, warriors who charged into the shield wall with eyes blazing and mouths foaming, their cries more like wolves than men. Many whispered that their strength came from Odin's hand, but in truth their frenzy may have been lit by darker roots. Mushrooms gathered from the damp earth, red-capped, white-spotted fly agaric, were said to stir visions of fire, blood, and unearthly power. A Viking man who swallowed them might find his limbs thrumming with fury, his mind ripped from the quiet of reason and hurled into a roaring sea, where pain no longer mattered. Others spoke of herbs, henbane seeds cracked and stirred into strong ale, their bitter taste masked by honey, but their poison burning the senses raw. Such a brew could drive a warrior into delirium, make his heart pound like a war drum, and twist fear into wild laughter. To drink it was to surrender to something greater, something primal, and once it took hold, the berserker felt no blade, no fire, no weight of iron upon his bones. He became a storm of flesh and steel, terrible to behold, unstoppable until his fury spent itself. The rituals were not taken lightly. Before battle, the chosen few gathered apart, their bodies daubed with soot, their voices raised in growls and chants. Viking food was set aside, for they needed no bread nor broth, only the dark brew that clawed at their veins. When they drank not for joy, but for transformation. The air quivered with the sound of their breath, harsh and ragged, as the fire within them rose higher than any hearth flame. To the enemy, they seemed like demons, their eyes wild, their strength unnatural, their wounds ignored as they tore through men and shield alike. To their kin, they were both blessing and curse, for the berserker brought victory, but his rage was not always easily stilled. And when the battle ended, when silence returned, many feared to look upon him, knowing that such madness could just as well turn inward. Thus the berserker brews lived in both fear and legend. They were the drink of those who dared to leave behind the quiet order of men and step into the wild heart of beasts. To taste it was to risk everything, yet to conquer with it was to carve one's name into the saga of the Vikings forever. The fly agaric, the battle mushroom, was as feared as it was revered, a strange gift of the northern soil that blurred the line between man and beast. Red-capped with pale white spots, it grew beneath the birches and pines, where shadows lingered, waiting for the hand bold enough to pluck it. To the Viking man who sought more than courage, it was no mere fungus, but a key to a darker gate, one that opened to frenzy, vision, and the roar of the gods. When warriors prepared for the shield wall, some did not turn only to mead or Viking food heavy with fat and smoke. They chewed this crimson cap, its flesh bitter as frost, and waited as their bodies trembled with the fire it carried. Soon, eyes widened, hearts thundered, and the world bent around them. Pain fled, fear drowned, and in its place rose a storm that no man could reason with. To the enemy, these figures seemed less like warriors, and more like raging spirits, striking with a ferocity that chilled even the bravest. The sagas whispered of berserkers who howled like wolves and bit the iron rims of their shields until blood ran from their mouths. Some claimed this madness was the will of Odin, that the battle mushroom carried a spark of his wisdom, his fury, his hunger for sacrifice. Others muttered that it was sorcery, that no Viking child should even look upon the red cap, lest it twist his spirit before his time. Yet still, in the quiet of the forest, the mushrooms were gathered, dried, and hidden away for the day when war called. The visions it brought were as wild as the frenzy. Shapes in the smoke, gods walking through fire, the dead rising in the din of the fight. A Viking seeress might say such sights were omens, glimpses of the other world carried on the bitter taste of the fungus. But to the warrior in the midst of it, they were fuel-blinding light, roaring sound, the collapse of man into something raw and unyielding. Yet the fly agaric was a perilous ally. One mouthful too much, and the strength it gave could turn to poison. Convulsions, madness, and death lingered close to its gift. A Viking man might rise to fight with the strength of 10, only to fall in the stillness after, his body spent, his spirit broken. It was the double edge of the mushroom, power at a price, glory bound to danger. So it was that the battle mushroom earned its place in memory, a symbol of both awe and dread. To some it was the whisper of gods in the blood, to others the shadow of demons. But to the Viking who dared consume it before battle, it was the key to fury, the red crown of earth that turned flesh and bone into legend. Henbane in the hearth was a whisper of danger, a shadow curling in the smoke of the Viking home. Its seeds were small, black and bitter, gathered from the wild places where few dared linger. To the unknowing it was poison, to the knowing it was a doorway. When cast upon the fire, its fumes filled the hall with a strange heaviness, and those who breathed too deep felt the world tilt, as though the floor itself swayed like the deck of a ship. A Viking man, hardened by battle, could sit by that hearth and feel his heart race, his thoughts scatter like startled birds, until he was certain unseen hands tugged at his soul. Not all use was reckless. The Viking woman, keeper of both food and healing, might grind henbane seeds into a bitter brew, offering it to dull pain, still fever, or coax sleep from the eyes of the sick. Yet even then it was a gamble, too much, and the calm turned to delirium visions of fire on the rafters, voices whispering from the corners, the dead stepping through the smoke. A Viking child who saw his father speak to shadows by the fire would never forget it, nor question whether gods or madness had entered the house that night. In rituals, the seeds found their darker purpose. Seeresses, wrapped in heavy cloaks, cast them into flames and breathed the smoke, swaying as their chants thickened. The hall grew silent as those gathered watched her eyes glaze, her voice deepen, her body tremble. Was she touched by Odin or seized by poison? To the people, it mattered little. The words she spoke, half vision, half delirium, were received as fate itself. Henbane gave her the strength to pierce the veil, though she might wake broken, drained, or screaming from dreams that clung like cobwebs. To many, henbane was not food nor medicine, but fire bound in seed. Viking men who dared its smoke could believe themselves wolves, dragons, or gods, but they risked never returning whole. Still, in the long winters when despair pressed heavy, and in the desperate hours before battle, some turned to it, willing to pay the price for one glimpse beyond the mortal veil. And so the hearth, that sacred centre of warmth and family, became at times a crucible of visions. In its smoke, the line between healing and madness blurred, between prophecy and folly vanished. Henbane was no gentle herb. It was both poison and gift, a companion as likely to guide a Viking toward the gods as to cast him into shadows from which there was no return. Seirices and visionary herbs were threads woven into the very fabric of the Viking world, where fate was never far and the unseen pressed close upon the living. The Volva, the seeress, was both feared and revered, a woman who walked the line between this world and the other. Wrapped in cloaks of fur and adorned with staffs carved in runes, she carried more than wisdom, she carried the breath of the gods themselves. Yet her power did not come from words alone. It was stirred by roots, seeds, and leaves that burned the tongue and bent the mind into strange shapes. When a Viking king sought counsel before a raid, or a chieftain trembled at the thought of broken oaths, they called the Volva. In the smoky hall, with men silent and the hearth casting flickering light, she drank from a cup steeped with herbs bitter and strong. Henbane, mandrake, perhaps even the red flesh of fly agaric plants that could twist sight until the rafters dripped with shadows. As the potion coursed through her, her body swayed, her voice rose, and the veil thinned. To those watching, she seemed half woman, half spirit, her words not her own but carried on the breath of Odin and the Norns. A Viking child, clutching at his mother's cloak, might peer from the back of the hall, wide-eyed, as the seeress began to chant. Her pupils widened, her breath rasped, and her face shone with a strange light. She spoke of ravens wheeling over battlefields yet unfought, of ships split by storms not yet born, of men who would not return though they feasted now. To hear her was to feel the chill of fate settling on one's shoulders. The herbs were her keys. Without them, she was but a woman with stories. With them, she was the mouthpiece of destiny, a vessel trembling under the weight of visions too great for mortal flesh. Viking men listened, not because they trusted her wholly, but because they feared not to. For if the gods had indeed spoken through her, to ignore her voice was to court ruin. Yet the path of the seeress was never without peril. The same herbs that opened her sight could twist her mind, leave her shaken, trembling, or lost in dreams too heavy to escape. Still, she returned to them, again and again, for her power lay in those visions, and her place in the world depended upon them. So it was that Viking kings raised their horns only after her words were spoken, Viking warriors marched only after her songs were sung. Herbs and prophecy bound them all, for in her trance they glimpsed the hand of fate. And whether she saw truth, madness, or both, none dared doubt, for in the Viking world, the line between vision and destiny was as thin as smoke rising from the fire. Smokes of the north curled through the rafters, like whispers from another world, heavy with scents that clung to the skin and stirred the mind. The Viking hearth was never just fire and flame. It was a cauldron of life where food was cooked, stories told, and spirits invoked. Into that blaze, herbs were cast not only for warmth or flavour, but for power. Sage, juniper, henbane, and resinous woods hissed as they caught the embers, filling the longhouse with smoke so thick it seemed to have weight, pressing on the chest, slipping into the thoughts of every Viking man gathered there. These fumigations carried many faces. To some, they were cleansing, driving out the sickness that lurked in winter air. To others, they were offerings, the rising smoke a bridge to the gods, curling skyward as though Odin himself breathed it in. Yet for many, the effect was closer, stranger, more immediate. The smoke wove itself into the head, softening the edges of reality until the hall felt larger, the fire brighter, and the chants of men deeper than bone. A Viking child, sitting in the corner with eyes watering from the haze, might have sworn he saw shapes moving in the drift. Wolves pacing, ravens wheeling, ancestors bending close to listen. There is talk in sagas of pipes fashioned from bone and horn, carried by wandering traders and healers, used to draw herbs into the lungs more directly. Whether for medicine, divination, or pure abandon, the act itself was ritual. A Viking warrior, crouched by the fire before battle, might have smoked to calm the tremor in his hands, only to rise later with eyes burning wild, convinced the smoke had carried him into Odin's hall and back again. The women, too, knew the craft. A Viking woman tending her home might burn juniper to guard against spirits, or fumigate her chamber before childbirth, the air thick with both prayer and pungent scent. In sacred rites, the vulva herself could vanish into smoke, chanting through the haze until her words seemed less spoken than carried on the fumes themselves. But smoke is never without danger. Henbane thrown on the hearth could loosen visions, yes, but it could also twist them, leaving men babbling to shadows or wandering into the night half blind. What cleansed one hall could curse another, for the north smokes were never tame, they were gifts and gambles alike. Still, they endured. Smoke was the unseen companion of every Viking feast, battle, and burial. It rose when the dead were burned, it lingered when warriors swore oaths, it wrapped itself around the living until they were not entirely of this world. In the Viking hall, smoke was not just air, it was spirit, it was weapon, it was vision, it was the north itself, breathing through its people. Mead with a twist was no gentle drink for idle hands, but a potion layered with cunning where honey's sweetness hid the bite of stronger herbs. The Viking man knew well the power of mead, but in the hands of skilled brewers and wise women, it became something greater, something that could lift the spirit high or drag it deep into shadows. Bog myrtle, juniper, yarrow plants of field and forest were gathered under watchful eyes, crushed, steeped, and poured into the golden flow until the horn carried more than honey. It carried the very breath of the land. When the feast began, the mead horn moved from man to man, yet not all horns were alike. Some held simple drink, sweet and warming. Others, brewed with the herbs of the wild, carried fire sharper than steel. A Viking warrior who drank deep might feel his blood surge, his limbs loosen, his laughter rise loud as thunder. Another might sit in stillness, eyes distant, seeing visions ripple across the fire's smoke. For these herbs, mixed with honey's warmth, did more than quench thirst, they shifted the mind. A Viking child, peering from the benches where food was spread meat heavy with fat, bread dark, from the oven, would watch his elders sway and sing, their cheeks flushed, their voices strange. He could not know if the herbs made them wiser or only more reckless, but he knew the horn was sacred, and what it held was not to be taken lightly. Bog myrtle sharpened the drink, giving it a bite that stirred boldness. Juniper brought a resinous fire, its smoke and taste mingling to clear the head yet make the heart race. Yarrow, plucked from meadows, was said to open the body to visions, to loosen the tongue for prophecy. The Viking woman who brewed these meads did so with care, for too much herb could turn joy to sickness, laughter to delirium. Yet when balanced rightly, the twist gave the drinker not only warmth, but wings of spirit. The longhouse filled with their power. Songs grew louder, boasts more daring, quarrels fiercer. Yet even as tempers flared, bonds tightened. For in drinking from the same horn, all men shared the same fire in their veins, the same herb-born haze. In those moments, the line between man and God thinned. Odin himself was said to have stolen the mead of poetry, and perhaps it was in these twisted brews that his gift lingered still. So it was that mead, with a twist, became more than drink. It was spell, courage, and madness bound in honey. To raise such a horn was to taste not only the sweetness of summer fields, but the wild, untamed heart of the north itself. And in the hall of Vikings, no greater bond was forged than in the sharing of that enchanted fire. High feasts of Valhalla were not imagined as quiet banquets, but as roaring storms of song, drink, and firelight, where mortal men believed they touched the very edges of eternity. In the smoky longhouse, with shields gleaming on the walls and the hearth casting wild shadows, the Viking man raised his horn, not for thirst alone, but for communion. Each draught was a step closer to Odin's hall, where warriors slain in battle drank forever in glory, their laughter echoing through the rafters of Valhalla itself. The feast was a ritual. Viking food meat dripping with fat, bread dark as the earth, fish pulled straight from the cold sea, lined the tables, but it was the mead that bound it all. Horns brimming with honey wine passed from hand to hand, each sip a sacred echo of the god's own revelry. A Viking child, huddled in the corner with eyes wide, would watch his father and kin roar with voices that seemed to shake the beams above, and he knew this was not mere drunkenness. This was a rehearsal for eternity. The mead hall was a hall of testing as much as feasting. A Viking warrior was measured not only by how he swung his sword, but by how he held his horn. To drink was to prove endurance, to join in brotherhood, to drown fear with fire. The songs sung were half prayer, half boast, weaving courage into every verse. Women moved through the hall with horns and bowls, their presence binding the feast together as surely as the drink itself. And when the toasts came to ancestors, to the gods, to those already feasting in Valhalla, the air thickened with a reverence that burned hotter than the fire. The intoxication was not mischief, nor folly. It was transformation. Men who had been weary farmers by morning became heroes by night, lifted from the mud of toil into the shining company of gods and fallen warriors. The haze of drink blurred the weight of earth, opening the soul to visions of long halls, golden shields, and endless battle, followed by endless feasting. A Viking man swaying in song could believe, for that night, that he already walked the benches of Valhalla, shoulder to shoulder with heroes. But beneath the joy, there was always gravity. Every feast was a reminder that one day each man would earn his place in that eternal hall only by steel and sacrifice. To drink in the present was to pledge oneself to that future. The horn was not just lifted to lips, it was lifted as an oath, a silent vow that when the time came, the drinker would not falter, but would join Odin's chosen. Thus, the high feasts of the Vikings were more than revelry. They were glimpses of immortality, tasted in honey and fire, where each horn drained was a step closer to the shining benches of Valhalla, and each roar of laughter a hymn offered to the gods. Alewives and brewing secrets were the hidden alchemy of the north, where Viking women bent fire, grain, and herb into potions that could warm the body or unshackle the mind. In the shadow of the longhouse, while Viking men sharpened axes and boasted of raids, it was the alewife who stirred the cauldron, who whispered charms over the bubbling brew, who held in her hands the quiet power of intoxication. The drink was not merely sustenance, it was sorcery, born of barley, honey, and the wild plants of the land. The Viking child might watch his mother scatter seeds of bog myrtle or leaves of yarrow into the steaming vat, her movements precise, her face solemn. She knew too well that each herb had two faces, one that soothed and one that scorched. A little juniper sharpened the senses, but too much could twist the drinker's mind into visions of fire and spirits. Some alewives even dared the darker path, adding henbane or fly agaric, slipping their drinkers toward delirium or prophecy, depending on the god's whim. A Viking man who lifted such a horn might feel not only warmth, but frenzy, a rush in the blood that turned a feast into a vision. Laughter grew louder, songs took on strange weight, and sometimes the hall itself seemed to waver, as if the walls bent beneath unseen hands. Was it the mead of Odin's wisdom, or the cunning hand of the alewife? Few cared to ask, for the brew carried them where they wished to go toward courage, forgetfulness, or divine encounter. These women held secrets older than the sagas. Brewing was no simple labour, but a ritual of timing, fire, and balance. Grains were malted with care, water heated with patience, honey poured like sunlight into darkness. Over all this, the alewife scattered herbs, gathered beneath moon or dawn, guided by knowledge passed from mother to daughter. What she brewed was more than drink. It was the unseen pulse of the community, the bond of feast and kinship. But there was fear in it, too. A horn too strong could bring wildness, a man raving in the corner, convinced that Odin's ravens perched on his shoulders. Another horn, brewed with gentler touch, could bring sleep so deep it seemed like death. Whispers spread of alewives who brewed not for healing but for hexing, whose cups carried mischief, madness, or the mark of sorcery. And so respect mixed with suspicion, reverence with unease. Yet without them, no hall could thunder, no feast could bind men together. The alewives were the unseen hand behind the roaring longhouse, their brewing secrets, twining courage, folly, and vision into every sip. In the Viking world, it was their craft that fed the fire in men's veins, their quiet power that made the horn more than drink. They were the keepers of intoxication, the hidden voices of the north, stirring not only ale but destiny itself. Odin's quest for the mead of poetry was more than a tale of theft. It was a saga of hunger, not for food or gold, but for the fire that burns in the mind. Long before Viking men raised their horns in smoky halls, the All-Father himself had risked all to seize a drink that promised more than warmth. This mead, born of blood and honey, was said to grant wisdom so sharp it cut through the veil of gods and men alike. To taste it was to taste ecstasy, vision, and the power of song that could bind kings or shatter their thrones. The tale begins in death. When Kvasir, the wisest of beings, was slain, his blood was mixed with honey and brewed into a mead unlike any other. Whoever drank it gained not just knowledge, but the gift of poetry, the very speech of the gods. Guarded by a giant named Suttung, this mead was hidden in the heart of a mountain, far from mortal hands. Yet Odin, in his ceaseless thirst, set his mind upon it. For what was wisdom worth if it could not be stolen, swallowed, and carried in secret? Disguised as a wanderer, Odin laboured for the giant's brother, Baugi. He bent his back to Viking toil, cutting hay, turning fields, eating the same coarse Viking food as any man. For his service he demanded not gold, not land, but a sip of the mead. Denied, he did not falter. He tricked, he schemed, until Baugi bore him to the mountain. With auger and wit, Odin bored into the rock, and in the shape of a serpent he slipped within, seeking the hidden treasure. There he found Gunnlod, daughter of the giant, set as guardian of the mead. She was no fool, yet Odin's voice, heavy with charm, bent her heart. For 3 nights he lay with her, and in return she allowed him 3 sips. But Odin was no man of moderation. With each draught he drained not a portion, but the whole, swallowing the mead of poetry into his very being. Transformed, he burst from the mountain in the form of an eagle, his wings beating with stolen fire. Suttung gave chase, and the sky thundered with their flight. At last Odin reached Asgard, where he spat forth the mead into waiting vessels, a gift for the gods, a spark for poets, skalds, and seers. Yet some drops spilled, falling to Midgard, and from these mortals found the ragged edges of inspiration, the madness and glory that came with song. For the Vikings, this myth was more than story. It was truth wrapped in verse, a reminder that intoxication was not only of body but of spirit. Mead could warm the flesh, yes, but in Odin's hands it became something greater, a fire in the skull, a song in the blood. His quest for the mead of poetry was the first drunken revel, the first vision, the first proof that even gods would risk all for the ecstasy of altered mind. In the Viking age, fire was more than warmth and flame. It was a mouth that spoke to the gods. When the ritual fire roared in the centre of a hall or upon a windswept hill, it carried with it more than heat. The Viking man who stood before it, the Viking woman who tended its embers, all knew that what was cast into that blaze rose higher than smoke. It was offering, it was prayer, it was the breath of the spirit world. And when resins and herbs were thrown upon the fire, the smoke thickened, curling like unseen hands, creeping into lungs and minds, until the hall itself seemed to blur into another realm. Amber, pine, juniper. These gifts of forest and earth were not burned for scent alone. Their fumes were a bridge, a way to cross from the world of men to the halls of gods. The Viking child, sitting near the hearth with wide eyes, would breathe it in and feel drowsy, as though dreams had walked into waking hours. Men who feasted beside the smoke felt their blood warm, and their thoughts turned strange, as if whispers floated in the curling haze. Some claimed to see the shapes of ravens or serpent coils drifting above the flame, visions born of smoke and faith. In ceremonies, seeresses cast sacred herbs into the fire before raising their staffs to summon prophecy. Kenbane seeds, when burned, loosed their bitter fumes, setting heads to spin and tongues to loosen in words not their own. Mugwort, sweet and sharp, was offered to grant clearer dreams. Even simple pine resin could conjure a trance when fed to flames, its heavy smoke lingering in hair, skin, and soul. A Viking man might stumble from the hall, his mind heavy with sights not his own, muttering that he had glimpsed the all, father's eye staring back from the blaze. The hearth was the heart of the Viking home, but in ritual, the fire grew into a living thing. Its smoke clung to the rafters, turned breath to prayer, and twisted sight into visions. To breathe it deeply was to be caught halfway between this world and another. In those moments, the boundary between flesh and spirit wavered. Warriors found courage, seers found words, and the people of the north felt the gods closer, as though they sat unseen just beyond the curling tendrils. So the fire was fed with care, resins gathered in summer were saved for winter nights, herbs dried with patience were offered in measured handfuls. For the Vikings knew that smoke could heal, but it could also unravel. A hall too thick with fumes could make men stagger, falling into madness instead of vision. And yet they returned again and again to the ritual fire, to the curling smoke that turned stone walls into dreamscapes, that made the breath of the gods drift down among them. For in that haze lay mystery, intoxication, and the unshakable sense that they were never drinking, feasting, or dreaming alone. The healers of the north were more than keepers of poultices and bone-setting hands, they were gatekeepers of altered realms. To mend the wounds of Viking men split by axe or pierced by spear, they turned not only to bandages, but to roots and leaves, whose powers slipped beyond the edge of the ordinary. In their huts, smoke clung to the beams, herbs hung drying from rafters, and the bitter scent of strange brews curled from clay bowls. Healing was never just a matter of flesh, it was as much spirit and dream, and often the cure carried a high that blurred the line between remedy and revelation. Mandrake root, when steeped and swallowed, brought on a heavy sleep so deep that a Viking warrior could endure the setting of a bone or the stitching of torn flesh with only muffled groans. Yet those who woke often spoke of wandering elsewhere, while their body lay still, of seeing giants stride across horizons, or of hearing their dead kin call through the mist. Henbane, crushed and brewed, numbed pain but also bent the mind, filling it with visions both wondrous and wild. A Viking child fevered with sickness might be given smoke from the seeds, and though his body calmed, his eyes might wander the room as if chasing shapes unseen. Even cannabis, growing in northern fields and traded through distant routes, was woven into Viking remedies. Its seeds soothed the stomach, its smoke eased pains of the joints, and yet when taken too deeply, it carried men and women into laughter, song, or sudden silence, where thought seemed to drift away. What began as medicine often became something more, a strange drifting of mind, a loosening of the spirit. The healers themselves were feared as much as they were trusted. When a Viking woman, skilled in herbs, laid a man upon a bed of furs and pressed to his lips a draught of dark brew, he knew that his pain might vanish, or that he might dream himself into the presence of gods. Some said that in their half-dream states, warriors received visions of battlefields yet to come, that they saw ravens circling over their own deaths, or ships drifting into stormy seas. What was meant to mend might just as well awaken prophecy. Thus, hallucinatory healing held a dual edge. It brought relief from agony, and it opened doorways to other worlds. The Viking man who drank deeply of henbane tea might rise healed in body, but forever altered in spirit, carrying with him the memory of visions he could not put to words. In those hazy spaces, healing was more than medicine. It was initiation into mysteries. For every wound bound and every fever soothed, another thread was tied between Midgard and the realms unseen, spun from roots, smoke, and the fragile breath of a dream. Far to the northern reaches, where the winds bit sharper and the snows clung longer, lived the Sami people, neighbours of the Norse. Among them, the shamans carried secrets that fascinated Viking ears, secrets bound not by sword or shield, but by the red-capped fly agaric mushroom. These spotted fungi, gleaming like drops of fire against the white tundra, were more than food. They were keys to realms unseen. When a Sami shaman consumed them, the world bent and rippled. His voice changed, his eyes burned with visions, and the spirits of beasts and ancestors seemed to crowd around the fire. It was a ritual that carried both terror and awe. The Vikings, ever hungry for both knowledge and power, did not turn a blind eye to such practices. Traders, hunters, and raiders alike crossed paths with the Sami, and tales of their mushroom rituals seeped south into longhouses and feasting halls. A Viking man might listen as a Sami elder described how the reindeer, feeding on the same mushrooms, danced wildly in the snow, their frenzy mirroring the shaman's own visions. Such sights were not dismissed as folly, but understood as a door to something larger, something that linked man and beast to the other world. It is said that certain Viking berserkers borrowed from these northern rites. Before battle, they sought the same mushrooms, consuming them raw or brewed, chasing the storm that lived within. Their frenzy, their wild screams that echoed over shield walls, bore the mark of altered minds, perhaps a gift first glimpsed in the Sami tents of the far tundra. Even Viking seeresses, who bent the will of herbs and smoke, may have drawn from the Sami's mushroom lore, shaping their own trance-like prophecies. Yet such power was never without danger. The fly agaric could just as easily bring death as vision. Too much, and a Viking man might collapse foaming at the mouth, his body convulsing as though seized by angry spirits. Too little, and only sickness came, without the soaring of the soul. The Sami mastered the balance, often filtering the mushroom through reindeer who ate it first, the animal's urine carrying the strength of the vision without the poison's bite. To Viking ears, this seemed both grotesque and divine, a strange alchemy of survival and spirit. Thus the mushrooms of the Sami found their way into Norse imagination. They were never merely food of the tundra, but bridges to gods, to madness, to courage that bordered on terror. Through northern winds and wandering shamans, these mushrooms left their mark upon Viking ritual and Viking war, teaching that sometimes the fiercest journeys were not carved upon the seas, but within the mind's storm. The night of the cider was no common gathering. It began when shadows deepened and the hearth fire was fed until it roared like a living beast, casting the walls of the longhouse in trembling light. Viking men sat silent, their rough hands gripping cups of strong mead, while Viking women drew closer, their eyes fixed on the veiled figure of the Volva, the seeress. She wore a cloak heavy with feathers and beads, and in her staff gleamed the runes of old. The air thickened as herbs burned on the coals, their smoke winding upward, bitter and sweet, filling every chest with a weight that pressed the mind into strange corners. Chanting began low, a rhythm steady as waves against the prow. The Volva swayed, her voice lifting into eerie tones that wrapped around the minds of all who listened. Drums thundered next, deep and primal, shaking the ground as though giants beat the earth with their fists. Each sound, each breath of smoke, pulled the Viking crowd into the same current out of Midgard, into the twilight where spirits stirred. Those who dared sip from the special brews passed around knew well the cost. Henbane, yarrow, and stranger herbs steeped in mead could blur the edge of sight. A Viking man who drank might see the hall's timbered roof twist into branches, might hear whispers from ancestors long buried. His body remained, but his spirit walked strange paths. Women too drank deeply, their eyes glowing in the firelight, swaying as if their souls drifted beyond their flesh. The vulva, deeper still in trance, called upon Odin and Freya, weaving her visions into words that bent the hearts of warriors. She spoke of battles yet to come, of ships sailing into storms, of sons not yet born. Her voice, ragged with smoke and song, carried the weight of gods. In that moment, no Viking doubted her. Whether king or farmer, all leaned forward, caught in the spell of her foresight. The Sidra was not merely performance, it was a tearing open of the veil, a dangerous voyage across the unseen. Spirits were welcomed, bargains made, enemies cursed. The smell of resin, smoke and sweat filled the longhouse, mingling with the cries of those overwhelmed by visions. A Viking child might cling to his mother's cloak, wide-eyed, while elders nodded solemnly, knowing that this was the old magic that bound their people to fate. When the fire at last dimmed and the drums ceased, silence reigned. The vulva, exhausted, slumped, as though lifeless, her body a husk, left behind after her spirit's wandering. Yet her words lingered in every ear. The night of the Sidra was never forgotten, for those who joined it felt the touch of the gods. Intoxicants, chants, and drums together had opened a door, and for a fleeting time the Viking world had stood at its threshold, staring into eternity. The mead hall stood as the proud heart of a settlement, its timbered roof echoing with laughter, song, and the clatter of drinking horns. But where there was fire and drink, there was always the chance of flame and fury. In the glow of torches, Viking men boasted of raids, of silver seized, of the enemies they had struck down. Viking women poured horn after horn, their hands quick, their voices sharp with jest. Mead foamed like golden rivers, and the stronger ales ran as freely as blood on a battlefield. It was here that brotherhood was tested not with blade and shield, but with the tongue, the boast, and the drunken daring of the night. Yet the same drink that bound them could unbind them. A Viking man's pride, once loosened by too much mead, could sour into anger. Words twisted like blades, insults flung sharper than steel. A jest about cowardice, a claim of stolen glory, or even a laugh too loud at another's tale could spark a storm. The hall, once alive with song, would suddenly erupt into shouts. Horns spilled, benches toppled, and fists cracked against jaws with the weight of unspent rage. Some nights it ended in nothing more than bruises and laughter, as the warriors rose, bloodied but grinning, clasping hands in drunken forgiveness. Other nights the fury did not pass so lightly. Knives flashed, and axes swung, turning feasts into funerals. The very bonds forged by fire and mead could be shattered in an instant, leaving families torn and leaders mourning men lost not to raids, but to their own brothers. Still, the chaos was not without its strange honour. To fight in the hall, under the gaze of kinsmen and gods alike, was seen by some as proof of spirit. A Viking child, watching from the shadows, might see his father rise in fury, striking blows that sang louder than any boast. He would remember that vision, for it taught him the thin line between strength and ruin. And so the madness of the mead hall was both a danger and a lesson. It showed the double edge of their drink, of what getting high in Viking times truly meant. The same horn that carried the sweet taste of courage could just as easily pour the bitter draught of destruction. Yet the people returned again and again, for the hall was life itself, song, feast, fury, and fate, all bound together beneath its roof. The madness was feared, but it was also expected, a storm always waiting at the end of revelry. In this, the Vikings revealed themselves, unbroken, untamed, fierce in joy as in war, bound by drink and forever threatened by its fire. In the dim light of the longhouse, where smoke curled thick against the rafters and the scent of roasted Viking food still lingered, there were rarer nights when the drink that passed from hand to hand was not mead alone. Among the treasures carried back from distant shores, silver, silk, and strange spices, there sometimes came vials and powders, dark gifts from foreign traders. These were the seeds of poppy, pressed into oils or steeped into brews, and when mixed with wine or ale, they opened doors no horn of honey could unlock. To taste it was to drift beyond the hall, beyond the crackle of the fire, into the realm of dreams and shadow. A Viking man who drank deep of this poppy wine would feel his body slacken, the weight of war and toil sliding from his limbs, as though the gods themselves lifted the burden. His eyes, heavy as winter skies, closed while his spirit wandered to places unseen. Some swore they walked with ancestors. Others whispered of visions, shores where the sea burned red, halls of gold brighter than Valhalla, or strange beasts lurking just beyond the edge of known lands. For a Viking seer, such dreams could be read as omens, and for a warrior, they were glimpses of the fate the Norns had woven. But the wine was no gentle gift. Its power was sharp, dangerous as a sword, too much. And the dreamer sank not into vision, but into oblivion, where sleep became a shroud, and waking never came. A Viking woman, tending the hearth, might watch with fear, as a man slipped too far into its hold, his breath shallow, his face pale as ash. The substance that carried one man to prophecy could carry another to death. Still, the allure was too strong to be cast aside. In rare moments of peace, when the harvest was good and the ships rested on their keels, the poppy wine was poured sparingly, shared among chieftains and skalds. Viking lords sought its embrace to ease wounds of both flesh and spirit. Skalds, their tongues loosened by its fire, spoke poetry that seemed touched by the gods themselves, words flowing like rivers from hidden wells. Even the hard-handed farmer, given a cup, might dream of plenty and awaken with a heart strangely lightened. So the poppy wine became part of their hidden lore, a treasure whispered about more than displayed, a substance feared as much as it was revered. It was a drink of dreams, a draught of death, a rare reminder that even in Viking times, getting high could carry one closer to the divine, or to the endless silence beneath the earth. There were nights when the sweetness of honey was not the gentle gift it seemed, but a doorway into danger and dream. Viking men prized honey above most treasures, for from it came mead, the golden drink that bound feasts and oaths. Yet not all honey was born equal. From the blossoms of rhododendrons in far-off mountains came a strange nectar, bitter beneath its sweetness, known only to traders and wanderers who had crossed those wild lands. This was the honey that could turn a Viking horn into something more than drink. It could unseat the mind itself. When stirred into ale or mead, this mad honey carried a fire that no ordinary brew could match. A Viking man might lift his horn with laughter, but as the warmth spread, his laughter twisted to confusion, and the hall around him shifted like smoke. Walls seemed to breathe, flames stretched into monstrous shapes, and shadows whispered like spirits of the dead. Some fell to the ground in shuddering fits, while others swore they saw gods walk among the benches. What seemed folly to one might be revelation to another, for in that dangerous sweetness visions took root. A Viking seeress could see such madness not as curse but as key. With a draught of honey steeped in its peril, she might step into a trance and speak the words of the Norns, her voice trembling with glimpses of woven fate. Chieftains, desperate for guidance, sometimes turned to this risky potion, hoping to catch sight of victory, even if it cost them reason for a night. Yet, in the same measure, a Viking child, given even a taste by mistake, could tumble into fever and peril. The line between prophecy and poison was as thin as a knife's edge. Stories spread of warbands who carried jars of such honey from foreign raids. In the quiet of campfires, men tested its power, their bodies shaking as they rose into wild laughter or collapsed into stillness. Some believed that warriors who drank it before battle became untouchable, their senses filled with divine frenzy, their courage sharpened past fear. But others muttered that the honey was cursed, for it left men hollow, their strength drained once the visions passed. So honey, that most sacred Viking food, could also become hallucinogen, both blessing and bane. In the golden glow of the mead hall, one horn carried joy, another held madness. It was the gamble of gods hidden in sweetness, and those who dared drink it knew they might wake with new wisdom or never wake at all. There were whispers in the long, dark nights that not all journeys began with footsteps, nor did all flights require wings. Among the hidden corners of Viking villages, where the smoke of the hearth clung low and secrets lived longer than songs, there were healers and witches who stirred strange salves in bowls of clay. These were no simple ointments for wounds. They were mixtures of nightshade and henbane, belladonna and herbs, known only to the daring. Bound together with animal fat, they birthed potions that carried the mind beyond the earth. A Viking woman who walked the path of sorcery might anoint herself with these brews, her skin drinking in their hidden fire. Soon her breath would quicken, her eyes would turn glassy, and the hall around her dissolved into a place of shadowed skies. She would say she felt her body grow lighter, as if lifted on the wings of ravens, soaring over the farmsteads and fjords. Others swore she travelled to the realm of spirits, gliding above the roofs of sleeping Viking men, slipping into worlds unseen by the sober. Whether true or only visions, such flights were feared, for they blurred the line between seeress and witch, healer and harbinger of doom. The Viking child who wandered too close to such craft would hear the drums, the chants, the muttered words, calling on gods not often spoken aloud. For these ointments were more than poison, they were gateways. A woman touched by them might wake with stories of sailing across seas of stars, or of meeting Odin himself upon his high seat, with wisdom dripping from his tongue like molten mead. Yet another might never wake, her heart stilled by the same venom that gave another her vision. It was said that in times of war, when fear pressed heavy, a Viking healer could prepare a salve for chosen warriors. Rubbed into their skin, it set their blood aflame, filled their minds with the thunder of gods, and for a time they fought as though untouchable, their limbs carried by unseen winds. But when the frenzy left them, they lay wasted, trembling like children after fever. Sorcery and flying ointments were the hidden edge of Viking life, never openly praised, yet never fully denied. For in a world where gods walked and spirits whispered, who could say if the sight of a witch soaring through the night sky was madness, lie, or truth? It was power carved from peril, and those who touched it knew that one taste of flight might cost the weight of their very soul. The longship groaned as it cut through black water, its prow rising and falling like the chest of a beast breathing in the night. Upon its benches sat Viking men hardened by salt and storm, their hands blistered from the oars and their bellies gnawed by hunger. Yet even in such harshness, the sea did not keep them from their strange indulgences. Fermented fish, carried in barrels until their stench was strong enough to gag a weaker soul, became Viking food both dreaded and desired. It filled the belly, and, when washed down with stale ale soured in the cask, left the mind dizzy, light as the gulls that circled above. Herbs travelled with them, tucked in leather pouches or bound in cloth. A pinch of bog myrtle or yarrow steeped in their drink brought not only taste but visions. Some Viking sailors claimed the herbs sharpened their eyes, helping them read the stars or sense a storm before it struck. Others admitted the brews blurred the sea and sky together until they swore they glimpsed spirits walking upon the waves. In such moments, a Viking man might laugh wildly at the spray of the ocean, his voice carrying into the storm like a challenge to Thor himself. The days stretched endless, the nights heavier still. A Viking child brought along for a first voyage would hear the men growl and sing in drunken unison, their rhythm sometimes steadier than the beat of the oars. When supplies thinned, the crew turned to what remained. Fish gone nearly rotten, ales thick with floating dregs, and herbs meant more for ritual than feasting. These became sustenance, but they also carried the men into altered states, where sea serpents were seen rising in the mist, and the northern lights above seemed like fires lit by gods. Such highs were not mere folly. They dulled the ache of frozen fingers, the terror of a ship tilting into a gale, and the bone-deep weariness of endless rowing. They made the Viking voyage more than survival. It became a test of mind and spirit, where the line between courage and madness grew thin as the horizon. A man stumbling in laughter after drinking from a horn might be the same man who leapt to his feet at dawn, axe in hand, ready to raid. Highs in the longship were not the feasts of Valhalla, but they were their shadow on earth moments, when Viking men, half-starved and half-drunk, touched something beyond themselves. Whether it was the sea's cruelty, the gods' mercy, or the poison of their own food and herbs, no one could say. What mattered was that they endured, oar after oar, with eyes glazed, yet spirits unbroken, carrying the fury of the north across every sea they dared to claim. In the telling of the old sagas, intoxication was never far from the gods themselves. What the Viking man knew in his hall, the blur of mead, the heat of ale, the dizzy fire of herbs, he also saw mirrored in the halls of Asgard. To drink until the world spun was not only human folly, it was divine example. Thor, red-bearded and fierce, was famed not only for his hammer, but for his thirst. In one tale, he was tricked into drinking from a horn connected to the very sea, and he swallowed so much that the tides themselves were said to have fallen. To the Viking child hearing this by the hearth, it meant that even thunder gods knew the haze of excess, and that drunkenness could be as mighty as a blow from Mjolnir. Loki, sly and quick of tongue, carried another lesson. His intoxication was not always from mead, but from the wild freedom of trickery. The sagas tell of him slipping into feasts, weaving insults and lies, each word sharper for the ale that loosened his tongue. Where Thor's drinking showed strength, Loki's showed the chaos that came when the mind was set loose without chains. To the Viking man who drank too deep at a feast, there was always the warning too much, and you might find Loki whispering through your own lips. And then Odin, Allfather, who drank not merely for pleasure but for power. His quest for the mead of poetry, stolen from the giants, was a tale that bound intoxication to wisdom itself. To sip that mead was to know verse, to speak with a tongue that could sway kings and summon spirits. Yet Odin's sacrifices showed the darker path. He gave an eye for knowledge, and in his search for hidden truths, he hung upon Yggdrasil, pierced and fasting, slipping into visions no mortal man could bear. In this, intoxication was not mead nor herb, but the raw ecstasy of suffering that broke the body and lifted the spirit beyond the mortal world. The Viking food, the Viking horn, the Viking hall, all were shadows of these greater tales. To grow drunk was not merely to lose sense, but to step, however briefly, into the realm of gods and giants. Each altered state had its patron. Thor with his endless thirst, Loki with his poisoned tongue, Odin with his visionary sacrifice. The sagas reminded Viking men and women that their revels and trances were echoes of a higher truth, that even in the feasting hall they touched the same dangerous, ecstatic fires that burned in Asgard. Thus, to get high was not only to stumble, to laugh, to rage. It was to join the gods themselves, where intoxication was both peril and power, a bridge between mortal flesh and the immortal storm. Not every horn of mead, not every herb in the fire, led the Viking man toward ecstasy or vision. Sometimes the high turned black, and the feast became a funeral. The sagas whisper of nights when alewives misjudged their brews, when Viking food was steeped with too much of henbane or yarrow, and the laughter of the hall curdled into cries of madness. Men clawed at their skin as if serpents writhed beneath it, or staggered into the fire with eyes wide as moons, struck blind by visions that were not gifts of Odin, but curses of their own folly. The battle mushroom, fly agaric, was not always a blessing. A Viking warrior who bit too deep might find not strength but sickness, his body racked with spasms, his tongue thick, his fury spent before the fight had even begun. There were tales of Viking berserkers who never reached the clash of steel, but lay foaming on the earth, their comrades dragging them away as ravens circled above. Such deaths carried no honour, for they came not from blade nor spear, but from the betrayal of a poisoned mind. Even honey, sweet and golden, could turn cruel. The mad honey from distant lands, carried in jars to the north, sometimes laced the mead with a sickness that struck without mercy. Viking men and Viking women alike fell into stupors, their limbs heavy as stone, their hearts slowed, some never rising again. What was meant to be a feast of joy could end with still forms stretched upon the rushes, their spirits sent not to Valhalla but to silence. The longships, too, bore their own dangers. Fermented fish and spoiled drink could twist the belly until death crept slow, leaving Viking sailors weak as waves towered around them. A man who should have stood firm at the oar would instead slump forward, vision swimming, and be swept into the sea like driftwood. The seeress herself was not free from peril. Herbs burned too strong, roots ground too fine, and her journey into visions could become a prison. Some never returned from their trance, their bodies breathing but their spirits lost in the mists beyond. In those moments, the gathered Viking folk would whisper that even the gods demanded payment for every glimpse of the unseen. For all their bravery, for all their hunger for ecstasy, the Vikings knew the edge was sharp. Intoxication was a gift that could become a curse in the same breath. To drink, to smoke, to chew, the herbs of the earth was to gamble with the soul itself. When the high went wrong, it was no jest. It was a grim reminder that the line between glory and doom was as thin as the rim of a drinking horn. When the White Christ came north, he came not only with cross and bell, but with judgment sharp as any sword. The missionaries who set foot in Viking lands saw not just warriors with axes, but feasts thick with smoke, horns brimming with mead, and rituals bound to herbs, mushrooms, and chants. To the Christian monk, the red-capped mushroom of the Viking berserker was no gift of the earth, but a devil's trick. The fumes of resin rising in the longhouse hearth were not prayers to the gods, but whispers of demons. It was the horn that troubled them most. The drinking horn, passed from Viking man to Viking woman, raised in honour of Odin, Thor, or the ancestors, was to the church a chalice of sin. Within its honeyed depths swam madness, lust, and heathen memory. Priests declared that to drink thus was to invite the serpent into one's soul, to drown not in mead, but in eternal fire. What for the Viking folk was joy, union, and the binding of kin, was painted as corruption by men robed in black. The vulva, the seeress who once sat crowned in smoke, fell hardest beneath their scorn. Where she had guided kings with visions, she was now condemned as a witch, her herbs called poison, her voice branded a tool of Satan. Viking children were warned by the new faith not to taste the leaves of henbane, not to breathe the smokes of the hall, not to dream the old dreams. Every herb, once tied to prophecy, was torn from the ground and cursed. But the horn did not fall silent easily. Viking men still raised it in their halls, still let the mead foam on their lips, still felt the rush of the herbs that turned night into storm. Yet the cross pressed harder with each generation, and the church built its strength not only in word but in fire. Alewives accused of adding strange herbs to their brews were dragged before altars. Farmers were told that even honey could be tainted by spirits of the underworld. To drink beyond measure, once a step closer to Odin's feast in Valhalla, was now branded sin. Still, in quiet corners, the old ways smouldered. A Viking child might sneak a berry, a Viking woman might whisper charms into her brew, a Viking man might chew a mushroom before battle and feel his blood burn as his forefathers once did. The horn was not so easily stolen, for it was more than drink. It was memory, it was defiance, it was the taste of a people who had feasted with gods. And though the church called it devil's work, to the Viking heart it remained sacred. A bond no sermon could wholly sever. The last toast in a Viking hall was never a quiet thing. It was the echo of all that had been poured into the night, the sweat of Viking men, the laughter of Viking women, the sharp cry of a Viking child chasing embers near the hearth. Horns raised high, glimmered with mead like liquid gold, catching the firelight as if the gods themselves reached down to drink with their people. In that moment, intoxication was not sin, nor mere pleasure, but the marrow of survival, the breath of the spirit, the bridge between earth and the halls of the divine. Every sip was more than honey and herb. It was the memory of ancestors who had carved their place from frost and sea, who had buried seeds in poor soil, and returned with harvest enough to brew. The Viking food that filled their bellies, the mushrooms and herbs that spun their minds into visions, the strong ales that steadied their courage, these were not indulgence alone. They were weapons as sharp as iron, binding together clans, lending strength to warriors, and opening the mind of seeresses to whispers from beyond. In the haze of smoke and song, a man did not simply stagger into madness. He touched the shadow of Odin's sacrifice, the endless thirst of Thor, the cunning fires of Loki. To drink was to step, if only for a heartbeat, into the realm of gods and giants. The hall itself became Valhalla in miniature, with every horn lifted a promise that no Viking stood alone, in life or in death. The last toast was never about forgetting the world. It was about remembering it with sharper fire, the storm sea that carried their ships, the dark soil that fed their grain, the laughter of kin that kept the long nights from breaking the spirit. Even in the poison of bad brews, in the madness of mushrooms gone wrong, in the deep slumber of poppy wine, there lay the truth of a people who wrestled with the earth and drank of it fiercely. So, the Viking man raised his horn not in rebellion, but in reverence. The Viking woman passed it on not in folly, but in faith. The child who watched knew that this was not escape, but endurance, a binding with gods, ancestors, and kin. And when the last toast rang through the rafters, it was not only to the feast, but to life itself, hard, fleeting, and holy, burning bright as fire before the long dark.